At the end of February in the year 2000, police arrived at the house of John Price around 8 a.m. They were responding to the calls from concerned coworkers who had swung by to check on him when he didn't show up for work. When they had arrived, they noticed blood on the front door and no one was answering. The police busted the door down, and as soon as they walked in, they could smell something burning. They noticed an insane amount of blood everywhere. They continued through the house and found what looked like human skin hanging from the ceiling. They proceeded to find the decapitated and skinned body of John Price. He was posed with his legs crossed in a chair, and right beside him sat his girlfriend, Katherine Knight, passed out from an apparent overdose attempt. Now that they knew where John was, they went to check and see what was burning in the kitchen. They opened the lid of a pot that was on the stove, and they found John's missing head cooking with vegetables. Find out what happened to John and who Katherine Knight is on today's episode of the TM Podcast. Welcome back to the TM Podcast. I am Travis, and today I'm going to talk about Katherine Knight, a female murderer from Australia. But before I do that, I'm going to go over some quick show updates. Shout out to Alex and Bobby for becoming new patrons. And speaking of Patreon, if you haven't become a patron yet, head on over to patreon.com/thetmpodcast and check out the exclusive content that I have for you. One specific perk that is about to be relevant is discounts on merchandise. I'm exploring different options now for suppliers for clothing and other things, trying to figure out what's best for the long term. I see other podcasts going through issues every time when they try out a printing or supply company, and I'm trying to avoid that before I get started to ensure that any of the products that I get out to you is of good quality. I'll keep you guys updated on that, so head on over to Patreon and check out my newest episode on the Bermuda Triangle and let me know what you think. Anyways, Katherine Knight. Katherine was born on October 24th, 1955 in Aberdeen, Australia. Her early life was nowhere close to perfect, but better than most that I talk about. Her mother got married young and had 4 children, only to get wrapped up in an affair that led to her divorce. She ended up marrying the man she cheated with and had 4 more children. I'm sure there's more detail and drama there, but it isn't necessarily relevant, so we'll move on. As a child, Katherine was subject to the tales of her mother's relationship troubles. Her new husband was violent and abusive, threatening and beating and even raping her mother regularly. Katherine was also sexually assaulted by a family member during her childhood, but I could not find any reference to who it was, just that it happened. In school, Katherine was a loner that acted out in fits of rage from time to time, once attacking her teacher and a small boy. She wasn't focused in school at all, and at 15, she decided that she had had enough. She left her Muswell Brook school without ever learning to read or write. She gained employment at a fabric cutting company, but that only lasted a year. After she left that, she got a new job that she loved. It was her, quote, dream job. That, of course, was working at a slaughterhouse. So if you're keeping track, Katherine is really building up an I'm probably going to grow up to be a murderer vibe. Illiterate, history of abuse, and now the love for dismembering animals. Great. Needless to say, she excelled at that job and was promoted and given her own set of butcher's knives, which she loved. She loved them so much that she allegedly kept them over the headboard of her bed at home just in case she needed to use them. If that isn't creepy enough, by that time, illiterate butcher Katherine had met a new love interest, David Kellett. David was a co-worker who had an excessive drinking problem due to several instances of trauma that he had lived through. One being that he had witnessed his friend be killed by a train, and also a school bus crash that killed several children. So of course, Katherine and him hit it off. They were known to cause trouble wherever they went and even got in fistfights together. Basically, what I imagine every biker's dream relationship to be. And if that wasn't enough to get all you Harley riders hyped up, in 1974, they got married, showing up to the event on their motorcycle, drunk. Their wedding started off with a bang as well. The very first night, Katherine tried to strangle David. Why, you ask? because David fell asleep after only having sex with her 3 times. Honeymoon ruined. Of course, this didn't slow the couple down at all, as they quickly decided that it was time to bring a baby into the world. While she was pregnant, Katherine's aggression got more out of control. One night, David returned home late from a darts game, so naturally, Katherine decided to burn all of his clothes. When he tried to interject, she hit him over the head with a frying pan. She hit him hard enough to actually fracture his skull. He had to crawl to the neighbor's house to find help. David refused to press charges when the police got involved because he loved her a lot, I guess. Love makes you do very stupid things. Ask David. Just a few years later, in 1976, after what I'm assuming to be 2 years of absolute hell, David left Katherine and moved away. This, to the surprise of absolutely no one, drove her up the fucking wall. The next day, she was spotted in the street pushing her child in a carrier, swinging it back and forth wildly. Concerned citizens called authorities and they took her to St. Elmo's Hospital, where she would stay and be diagnosed with postnatal depression. As soon as she was released a few weeks later, she took her child and placed her on railroad tracks and left her. She then stole an axe and went through the town, threatening anyone she met along the way. Luckily, a homeless man found the child on the railroad tracks just minutes before the train came through and contacted police. Katherine was arrested and taken back to St. Elmo's Hospital. If you haven't figured out, St. Elmo's Hospital is a mental facility. But just one day later, she signed herself out of the hospital and went back home. I'm not really sure as to why she didn't go directly to jail for child endangerment, or at the very least for the threats of the people in town, but she didn't, and the very, very obvious mental break that she was having continued. A few days after leaving the hospital, she approached a stranger with a knife, slashed her in the face, and told her, "Take me to Queensland." Queensland is where her ex David had moved after the split. The woman complied and started driving. She drove for a while, but Katherine had her stop at a gas station, and as soon as the car was stopped, the woman took off running, which was a pretty good move. Instead of just driving the car to Queensland herself, she got out, went into the store, and took a boy hostage. The police arrived pretty quickly and disarmed her and took her straight to a psychiatric hospital. While she was there, she told some of the staff that her plan was to kill the mechanic that was at that gas station because he was the one that had fixed David's car that allowed him to run away from her. After that, her plan was to go find David and kill him and his mother. And once again, for no reason that I can find at all, she was released into the public and served absolutely no jail time. So her list of offenses as of her time of release, which was August 9th, 1976, should have been domestic violence, assault, attempted murder, robbery, and of course, child endangerment. But like I said, no jail, no real repercussions. And as if that wasn't crazy enough by itself, in comes one of the dumbest things that I have ever heard. When David heard about what happened, when he heard that his batshit crazy, recently separated wife planned to drive all the way to him and kill him and his mother, he decided that he wanted to come back and be there for her. He even brought his mother along. I'm going to take a second to let you process that information. Okay, now that you're back and still confused, I assume, there was a moment where every one of you listening to this thought to yourself about the craziest person that you've been with, and that unspoken mental Venn diagram where one circle is fucking crazy and the other side is crazy fucking. Now that small area in the middle that overlaps is usually where your mind puts that person, and you probably remember the mental gymnastics that you played trying to convince yourself that the craziness was a fair trade-off for crazy fucking until it blew up in your face. So what I'm saying is keep that in mind as we move on. David and Katherine got back together and had a good 4-year run before having another child. By this time, Katherine was working at another slaughterhouse and life seemed to be good. But in 1984, Katherine decided that she was done with the life that she fought so hard for with David and left him. Shortly after, she hurt her back at work and was put on disability. That put her in income-based housing in Aberdeen, and this is where the story would end if her psychosis was brought on specifically by David. But as you probably guessed, it wasn't. She met another man in 1986, also named David. Their relationship wasn't different from the one with the original David: sex, fighting, separation, makeup, and so on. This cycle took another crazy turn in 1987. She picked up David's brand new puppy and cut its throat right in front of him, saying that he would suffer the same fate if he were to ever step out on her. As if that didn't prove her point, she then knocked him out with a frying pan. This lady honestly seems like an exaggerated cartoon version of a person. It just doesn't seem real. But just as the man before him, David 2.0 stayed with her and did not press charges. A year later, they had a child. They also got a house, and Katherine decided to decorate it with bones, skulls, and animal skins from the things that she liked to hunt. Another year went by, and their arguments escalated to the point where Katherine hit David in the face with an iron one night and stabbed him in the chest with a pair of scissors. He didn't die, and once again, just like the David before him, didn't press charges. He decided instead that he would just run away, and he went into hiding for a couple of months. When he finally felt like it was time to come back, he found out that when he left, Katherine had taken out a restraining order against him, saying that she feared that he would hurt her. Now, how many of you have heard a similar situation like this where the abuser makes everyone else think that they are the victim? Obviously confused and rightfully scared, he decided that it would be a great time to end the relationship and move on. A decision that he probably looks back on now as the smartest thing that he's ever done, and I would have to agree with him. Katherine moved on again to another man named John in 1990 and had another child. There really isn't much information that I could find out about this specific relationship, but it's safe to say that he probably got bonked on the head with a frying pan at least at some point. Their relationship only lasted 3 years before she left him for a recently divorced man that she had been seeing on the side anyways, John Price. I know this is confusing, but yes, Katherine was with 2 Davids in a row, and now she's on her second John. According to John's friends, by 1995, he had moved Katherine in with him, and despite a few violent arguments, he said that everything was roses. That is early 1990s male code for the sex was great. Also, a side note to anyone listening who relates to those last 2 sentences, violent arguments are not normal regardless of how good the sex is, and no, yelling and screaming isn't a representation of how hard that person loves you. Leave that person. The relationship started to head downhill in 1998 when Katherine was ready to get married, but John was not a fan of that idea. She was pissed and stole some of his money and bought herself an engagement ring. Even though she went that far, he still said no, he did not want to get married. This made her so mad that she took a video of some of the items that he had brought home from work and sent them to his boss, claiming that he had stolen them. Even though the things that he took were out of the trash and out-of-date medical kits, his boss fired him anyways. He had held that job for 17 years. So, rightfully pissed off, John kicked her out immediately and was so mad that she would take his career away over something they had only briefly argued about. And John lived happily ever after. The end. Unfortunately, you know that is not the case. Just a few months later, John took Katherine back under one condition. She could not move back in. Katherine accepted the terms and it was right back to normal. John's friends became very angry with him for being so stupid, and those sound like great friends. Katherine quickly became upset with the situation again, and their arguments started to happen more and more often. They escalated to the point of another attack in early 2000 when Katherine stabbed him in the chest with a knife. He survived and kicked her out again. Instead of pressing charges, he went and got a restraining order on February 29th, 2000. That day at his job, he told his friends what he'd done and told them that if he didn't show back up to work the next day, it was because his girlfriend killed him. His friends told him that he shouldn't go back home, but he argued that he was afraid she might hurt his children. He went home that evening to find that Katherine had sent the kids to a sleepover at a friend's house and she wasn't there either. He hung out with his neighbor for a while and then came home and went to bed. Katherine came in and woke him up around 11, they had sex, and he went back to sleep. Now, I'm not really sure on the specifics between him kicking her out and getting the restraining order, but it seems like they were on a little bit better terms and he was trying to sneak up on her with this information. So they had sex, he went back to sleep, but at some point in the night, he woke up to being stabbed by Katherine. He jumped up and tried to flee, slipping in his blood and running for the door. He made it that far, only to collapse and be drugged back inside. Katherine then got on top of him and stabbed him 37 times, killing him just feet away from where they had just had sex hours before. As John laid on the floor, Katherine decided that she would go to town, and she withdrew around $1,000 from John's account. When she came back, she used her skills that she had learned from the slaughterhouse and removed all of his skin. She put it on a meat hook and hung it from a doorway. She then cut his head off and put it on the stove in a pot with vegetables. She took some of his internal organs and cooked them with a baked potato, pumpkin, squash, and gravy. When it was cooked, she set the dinner table. She put a plate at each chair, labeling them with the names of John's children. She also made a plate for herself, but threw it out in the yard instead of eating it. She then posed what was left of John's body in a chair before writing a short note that read, "Time got you back for raping my daughter, you to Beck for Ross, for Little John. Now play with Little John's dick, John Price," before taking some pills in an attempt to end her own life. The original note was a grammatical nightmare, but that's the best that could be done in terms of understanding it. This brings us to where we started. The police come in and find all of this, revive Katherine, and take her to jail this time. At her trial, she originally pled not guilty to murdering John, but changed it to guilty when it was obvious that no one in the world would believe for a second that she wasn't the one that committed this crime. Her attempted claims of John raping her daughter was completely unsubstantiated and thrown out as even a possibility for motive. It was also discovered that she had recorded a video the day before she killed John, talking to her children in what would later be interpreted as a strange will of sorts. She claimed that she had no memory of any of her actions that night and could not give the judge any information on why she had not only killed John, but cooked him with the intention of serving him to his children. The judge had her evaluated by a psychiatrist, and it was determined that she had obvious mental issues, but was still considered sane enough to know the consequences of her actions. An interesting fact is she removed John's skin so well that she did not even mark his bones, and the mortician was able to sew the skin back on. Yikes. The judge stated that due to the nature of her crime and her complete lack of remorse, led him to charge her for the murder and sentence her to life imprisonment. He also denied her the possibility of ever being paroled and marked all of her legal documents with the phrase, "never to be released." At the time of this trial, it became the first life sentence ever handed down to a female in Australian history. In 2006, she tried to appeal the sentencing, but it was immediately denied. She's still alive as of 2020 and is being held in a correctional facility in South Wales. So, firstly, what the fuck? That is such a wild ride of a situation. A couple of unanswered questions I leave this case with is, how the hell was she not in jail earlier for literally any of the things she did? And how could you stay with someone who kills a dog, much less your dog, in front of you? And what do we not know about her that we're never going to find out? Going from punching to dismembering someone and cooking them seems like an insane progression. Something else had to happen along the way. But the biggest takeaway from this story in my eyes is that this is an incredibly good example of how far abuse can go. These men were so abused and controlled by her that they lost their sight of reality and subjected themselves to hell every day. It's easy to say, why didn't they just leave this crazy woman? When you aren't there to understand the extent of manipulation and intimidation that an abuser uses on their victims. Abusers come in all shapes, sexes, and sizes. Don't let the modern day stigma of abuse be your definition and allow you not to see someone in need. If you know someone who is in a situation like this, or even close, get them help. You never know when an abuser will escalate from verbal to physical, or when a few punches turn into murder, just like in this case. No one deserves to die at the hands of an abuser. If you or a friend need help and are in a situation like that, Call 1-800-799-7233 or go to thehotline.org for immediate assistance in the U.S. Contact your local assault representative or police for non-U.S. listeners. Let me know what you think about Katherine and this episode, or any of the other episodes, by messaging me on any of the social accounts for this podcast. You can also reach me directly at tmpodcast19@gmail.com. If you'd like to decide what I cover on this podcast or on the Patreon, please head on over to patreon.com/thetmpodcast and become a patron today. I appreciate every one of you who has reached out to me to ask about new content and what I have coming. Thank you for listening to the TM Podcast, and as always, never forget,
tough time never lasts. Only tough people last.